If you think blocking your own driveway can get you arrested, wait until you hear what happened next. The smell of hot asphalt still lingered in the late afternoon air as I killed the engine of my truck, gravel crunching under the tires, the hood ticking softly from the drive back, and I stepped out with that familiar weight in my shoulders that only comes from months away from home. Reaching into the bed to grab the first storage bin when I heard heels striking pavement fast and sharp behind me. "You can't park there," she snapped. Not even a second of hesitation, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment, and I turned just enough to see her. Perfect posture, phone already in her hand, eyes locked on me like I didn't belong on the concrete I'd paid for, and I said calmly, "It's my driveway." But she didn't even slow down, already tapping her screen, already escalating. "No, it's not, and you're blocking access. I'm calling the police," her voice rising just enough to draw attention, just enough to make heads turn behind curtains and blinds, and I could feel it, that subtle shift. In the street, the quiet hum of curiosity turning into judgment, neighbors stepping out onto porches, someone across the road lifting their phone, recording, and I stood there in my own driveway, dust still on my boots, holding a storage bin like I was the one caught doing something wrong. And she kept going, pacing now, pointing at my truck like it was evidence. "I've lived here long enough to know every resident, and you are not one of them." And that line hung in the air heavier than the heat, because it wasn't just about the driveway anymore. It was about control, about who gets to belong and who gets pushed out. And I set the bin down slowly, deliberately, feeling the rough edge of the plastic scrape against my palm, grounding myself, because I'd seen this before, different place, same tone, same certainty from someone who had no idea who they were talking to. And I let her talk. Let her build her case in front of everyone watching. Let her describe me as a stranger, as someone pretending, as someone who needed to be removed. And the word choice mattered. I noticed that, the way she said it like she'd already decided the outcome, and the siren came sooner than expected, faint at first, then louder, cutting through the warm stillness of the neighborhood. And I could see it in her face, that flicker of satisfaction, like everything was unfolding exactly how she wanted, like she'd done this before, and it always ended the same way. And I leaned against the side of my truck, arms relaxed, saying nothing, because sometimes silence says more than anything else. Sometimes it gives people just enough rope, and she filled every second of it, telling the dispatcher I was refusing to leave, that I was blocking community property, that I was being aggressive. Even though I hadn't raised my voice once, and the first patrol car rolled in, tires humming against the pavement, officers stepping out, scanning the scene, their eyes moving from her to me to the truck, and she rushed toward them before they even closed their doors, already mid-sentence, already framing the story, and I could feel every phone still pointed in my direction, every neighbor waiting for the moment this turned into something bigger, and I stayed exactly where I was, right in the middle of my own driveway, hands visible, posture steady, letting the moment stretch just long enough for everything to settle into place, because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the story she was telling was about to flip in a way she couldn't take back. And as another vehicle pulled up behind the first, engine idling low, I took a slow breath and finally looked up, meeting her eyes for just a second, calm, steady, almost curious, because I'd seen how this ends, and it never ends the way they expect. I could hear Rebecca's voice cutting through everything as she stood beside the officers, explaining the situation like she was reading from a script she had memorized 100 times, her tone confident, controlled, almost practiced, and I watched the way one of the officers nodded slightly as she spoke, like her certainty alone was enough to shape the narrative, and I stayed where I was, leaning lightly against my truck, feeling the warmth of the metal through my shirt, letting the moment breathe instead of rushing to defend myself, because there is a difference between reacting and responding, and I have spent years learning that difference the hard way, and one of the officers finally turned toward me, calm but firm, asking for identification, asking if the vehicle was mine, asking if I lived at this address, and every question was reasonable on its own, but stacked together, in front of an audience already leaning one way. They felt like a quiet assumption that I needed to prove something that should have been obvious, and Rebecca stepped in again before I could even answer fully, talking over me just enough to redirect attention back to her, emphasizing that I had been blocking access, that I had refused to move when told, that I was being uncooperative, and I noticed the way she never once said the words "my driveway." Only community, shared, restricted, like language itself was part of how she controlled the situation, and I reached into my back pocket slowly, pulling out my wallet, careful, deliberate, handing over my identification without a word. And the officer glanced at it, then at me, then back at it again, like something did not quite line up in his head. But before that moment could settle, Rebecca filled the space again, stepping closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound more serious, more credible, mentioning that she had connections, that her family was involved with the nearby base, that she understood protocol, and I caught that detail immediately. The way she said base, like it gave her authority here, like it elevated her above everyone else on the street, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not even frustration, just a quiet recognition of where this was heading. And the second patrol car door closed behind me with a heavier sound, drawing a few more neighbors closer, their footsteps soft on the pavement, phones still raised, still recording, capturing every second of a situation they did not fully understand. And the officer holding my identification asked me one more time, slower this time, confirming my name, and I answered clearly, steady, Nathan Brooks. And for a split second, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, something subtle, like a memory just out of reach, but it passed as quickly as it came, and Rebecca seized that moment too, stepping forward again, pointing toward my truck, saying it needed to be moved immediately, that I could not just occupy space like that. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so precise, so revealing, the way she framed ownership as permission granted by her, not something inherent. And I stayed exactly where I was, not moving the truck, not raising my voice, not interrupting her, because every second she spoke was another layer being added, another piece that would not disappear once the truth surfaced. And I could hear the faint hum of another engine approaching from down the street, slower, heavier, not like the patrol cars, and the air seemed to tighten just a little, like something unseen was about to enter the scene. And Rebecca kept talking, unaware, confident, explaining how people like me try to slip into neighborhoods, how rules exist for a reason, how enforcement is necessary. And I let her words settle into the space between us, into the phone's recording, into the ears of the officers, into the quiet attention of every neighbor watching. Because once words are out there, they do not come back the same. And I shifted my weight slightly, straightened up from the truck, and for the first time since she started, I looked directly at her, not with challenge, not with anger, just steady. And in that moment, the sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder, closer, until it finally pulled in behind the patrol cars, engine idling low, and something in the posture of the officers changed before anyone even said a word, subtle but unmistakable. Like a signal passed without sound, and I took a slow breath, feeling the heat of the day, the weight of the moment, and I knew exactly what was about to happen next, even if she did not. The engine behind the patrol cars idled with a deeper, steadier rhythm, not rushed like the first two, and I saw one of the officers shift his stance before he even turned around, like his body recognized something before his eyes did, and Rebecca kept talking right through it, her voice sharp, confident, building her case as if nothing in the world could interrupt her momentum. "I told you, he just showed up and started acting like he owns the place," she said, gesturing toward me without even looking back, and I watched the moment stretch, the exact second where control begins to slip, but the person holding it does not realize yet, and the car door behind them opened with a solid, deliberate sound, not loud, but enough to change the air, and footsteps followed, measured, unhurried. The kind of steps that do not need to rush because they already know where they stand. And one of the officers beside Rebecca straightened slightly, his tone shifting just enough when he spoke over his shoulder, "Sir." And that single word landed differently than everything else that had been said so far. And Rebecca paused for half a second, just enough to register that something had changed, but not enough to understand what. And I pushed myself off the side of my truck, standing upright now, shoulders squared but relaxed, the weight of the moment settling into place exactly where I expected it to, and the new arrival stepped into view, his gaze moving across the scene quickly, taking in the officers, the truck, the neighbors, and then landing on me, and I saw it instantly, that flash of recognition, that immediate recalibration that comes from understanding context in a single glance. And he gave a short nod, respectful, precise. "Colonel Brooks," he said, clear and steady, not loud, but loud enough that it carried across the quiet street. And everything stopped, not gradually, not awkwardly, but completely, like someone had cut the sound out of the entire block, and I could feel it in the way the air seemed to hold still, in the way the phones that had been raised just seconds ago hesitated mid-record, in the way Rebecca's expression shifted without fully understanding why. And I returned the nod, simple, controlled, at ease, I said, because old habits do not disappear just because you are standing in a driveway instead of a briefing room. And the officer who had been holding my identification looked back down at it, then back at me, his posture adjusting almost instantly, the assumption from earlier dissolving into something more measured, more careful, and Rebecca finally turned fully toward the new arrival. Confusion breaking through her certainty for the first time. "What is going on?" she asked, her voice no longer as sharp, no longer as steady, and no one answered her right away, because the answer was already there, written across the shift in posture, in tone, in the way the entire scene had quietly reoriented itself around a truth she had not considered, and I watched her eyes move from the officer to me, searching for something to hold on to, something to reassert control, and she tried, stepping forward again, her voice tightening. "I called because he is blocking access. He is not supposed to be here." But the words did not land the same way anymore. They felt thinner, like they had lost the weight she thought they carried, and the officer beside her spoke this time, calmer, more deliberate. "Ma'am, this is his residence." And that sentence settled heavier than anything else so far, because it was simple, undeniable, and it directly unraveled everything she had been building. And I could see it happen in real time. The realization not fully formed but already unavoidable, and she shook her head slightly, like rejecting it might make it less true. "That is not possible," she said, quieter now, and I let a small breath out, not relief, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. Because moments like this are never as loud as people expect them to be. They are quiet, precise, and final, and I stepped forward just enough to close the distance between us by a few feet, not aggressive, not confrontational, just present, and I met her eyes again, steady as before, and for the first time since this started, I spoke more than a few words, my voice even, controlled, carrying just enough to reach everyone still watching. "You should have asked before you called." And I did not raise my tone, did not add anything else, because I did not need to, and the silence that followed said everything for me. Rebecca's face held that frozen half-second where everything inside her was trying to rearrange itself into something that still made sense, but nothing quite fit anymore, and I could see it in her eyes, the way certainty was slipping into something sharper, something more defensive, like she was already searching for a version of the story where she was still right, and she drew in a breath, shoulders tightening. "While that does not change the fact that he is blocking access," she said, trying to pull the situation back into her control, but the words landed softer now, like they were missing the force she had been leaning on just moments ago, and one of the officers glanced at the driveway, then back at her, his tone even, almost neutral. "Ma'am, he is allowed to park on his own property," and that sentence did more than correct her. It shifted the ground she had been standing on, because it was not about interpretation anymore. It was about fact, and facts do not bend just because someone speaks louder, and the neighbors who had been watching started to shift too, subtle at first, a step back here, a lowered phone there, like the energy of the crowd was recalibrating in real time, and I could feel the weight of their attention change, not gone, but different, more cautious, more aware that they might not have been watching what they thought they were watching, and Rebecca noticed it too. Her gaze flicking toward them for just a second before snapping back to me, like she needed someone to anchor her version of events, and when she did not find it, her voice sharpened again, but now there was an edge of urgency under it. "He still cannot just block everything like that. There are rules, there are guidelines," and I nodded slightly, not agreeing, just acknowledging that she was still trying to hold on to structure, onto something that felt official, and I spoke calmly, my voice steady, for about 45 seconds while I unload my own truck. And I let that number sit there, specific, grounded, something real compared to the abstract claim she had been making, and the officer closest to me gave a small nod. almost imperceptible, like he understood exactly what that meant, and Rebecca opened her mouth again, but nothing came out right away this time. And that silence was louder than anything she had said so far, because it was the first time she did not have an immediate answer. And I took a slow breath, feeling the air move through the space that had been so tense just minutes ago. And I glanced down at the storage bin still sitting where I had placed it, the edge slightly scuffed from the concrete, a simple, ordinary detail that had somehow turned into the center of all this. And I reached down, picked it up. Again, the weight familiar, steady, and I turned toward my garage like this was finally going to continue the way it should have from the beginning. And that movement, that simple act of resuming, seemed to unsettle her more than anything else, because it meant the moment was moving past her control, and she stepped forward quickly. "You cannot just ignore this," she said, louder again, trying to pull everything back into focus. But the officers did not move this time. They did not follow her lead, and that was the difference. That was the shift she could not undo. And I paused just long enough to look back at her, not stopping what I was doing, just acknowledging her presence. And I said, evenly, "I am not ignoring anything." And I let a small pause settle between us before finishing, "I am just not doing what you expected." And that landed exactly where it needed to, because it was not confrontational, it was not aggressive, it was simply true. And truth has a way of cutting through noise without raising its voice. And the second officer who had arrived earlier cleared his throat slightly, stepping in with a tone that was measured, procedural. "Ma'am, there is no violation here. We are going to clear the call." And those words carried a finality that no argument could push back against. And I saw it then, the exact moment it hit her, not all at once, but enough to understand that this was no longer a situation she could steer, that the authority she thought she had borrowed was not hers to use the way she had tried to. And the street, which had been holding its breath, began to exhale, quiet conversation starting up again, phones lowering, doors opening and closing as people retreated back into their homes, taking the story with them. And I turned back toward my garage, lifting the bin slightly to adjust my grip, the simple weight of it grounding, familiar, real, and behind me, the sound of Rebecca's voice came again, but softer now, less certain, as if even she could hear the difference. And I did not turn around this time, because some moments do not need a response. They just need to be left exactly where they are. The garage door creaked open with that familiar low hum, the kind of sound that should have been the loudest thing on the street. But even that felt quieter than the tension still hanging behind me. And as I stepped forward with the storage bin in my hands, I could still feel her presence a few feet back, not as sharp as before, but not gone either. Like she had not decided whether to let the moment end or try one more time to take it back. And I set the bin down just inside the garage, the concrete cooler under my boots, the air slightly different in here, calmer, controlled. And I paused for a second, letting that shift settle in, because stepping into your own space after someone tries to take it from you always feels different, more deliberate, more defined. And behind me, I heard her voice again, not loud enough to command the street anymore, but not quiet enough to disappear. "This is not over," she said, and there was something new in it now, not confidence, not authority, but something closer to frustration trying to disguise itself as resolve. And I turned halfway, just enough to see her standing near the edge of the driveway, arms crossed tightly, phone still in her hand, but no longer raised. And the officers were already beginning to step back toward their vehicles, their presence no longer centered on me. The situation already moving toward closure whether she accepted it or not. And I leaned one shoulder lightly against the garage frame, not blocking anything, not advancing, just existing in the space that had been mine the entire time. And I met her eyes again, steady, unchanged, and for a moment neither of us spoke. And that silence carried more weight than anything that had been said earlier, because now there was nothing left to prove, only something left to understand. And she broke it first, her voice tighter now. "People like you think you can just do whatever you want." And I let that sit there, because it revealed more than she realized, the assumption underneath it, the belief that authority was something visible, something that had to announce itself loudly to be real. And I shook my head slightly, not dismissing her, just correcting the space between us. "No," I said calmly. "People like me follow the rules so closely that we know exactly when someone else is trying to bend them." And I could see the words land, not fully accepted, but not ignored either. And one of the officers paused near his car, glancing back for a second, like he understood this part was not about enforcement anymore. It was about perspective, and Rebecca shifted her weight. Looking down the street briefly as if searching for support that was no longer there, the neighbors now mostly gone, the phones lowered, the moment no longer something to watch, but something to process later, and when she looked back at me, the certainty from before was gone, replaced by something quieter, something less defined. "You could have just told me," she said, and that was the closest she had come to acknowledging any part of what had happened, and I nodded once, slow, deliberate. "I did," I replied. "You just decided it did not matter." And that was the truth of it, simple, direct, without edge, and it settled between us like the final piece of something that had been building since the moment she walked up, and the officer who had first approached me stepped forward slightly, his tone professional. "Sir, everything is clear on our end." And I gave a small nod in return, appreciation without ceremony, and he turned back toward his car, the engine starting up moments later. The low rumble signaling the official end of something that had felt much bigger just minutes ago, and I stepped fully into the garage then, picking up the next box, the cardboard rough against my fingers, the motion steady, ordinary, grounding, and as I carried it deeper inside, I could still hear the faint sound of her standing there, not speaking anymore, just present, and that silence was different now, not charged, not confrontational, just unresolved, and I set the box down beside the first, aligning it carefully, the way I always did, small details, small controls, the kind that do not draw attention but keep everything in order. And when I turned back toward the driveway, the space looked exactly the same as it had before all of this started, the same concrete, the same truck, the same late afternoon light stretching across the pavement, but it felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because something had been clarified, something had been tested, and settled without needing to be forced, and I stepped forward again, back toward the edge of the garage, ready to finish what I had started, knowing that this time, nothing was going to interrupt it. I stepped back out into the driveway with the next box in my hands, the late afternoon sun hitting the concrete at that low angle. That stretches everything just a little longer than it really is, and for the first time since this started, there were no sirens, no raised voices, just the quiet hum of engines fading as the patrol cars pulled away one by one, tires rolling slowly past the curb like nothing had ever happened, and I watched them go for a second, not because I needed to, but because moments like that always mark a shift, a clear line between what was and what is, and when the last car turned the corner, the street settled into a kind of silence that felt earned, not empty, and I turned back toward my truck, setting the box down in the garage with a steady motion, aligning it beside the others, each one a small step back into normal, and when I straightened up again, she was still there, a few feet from where she had been before, but something about her posture had changed, not as rigid, not as certain, like the energy she had been holding onto had finally started to drain away, and she looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way someone does when the ground they were standing on turns out to be thinner than they thought, and I walked back toward the truck, reaching into the bed for another container, the metal cool now under my fingers as the heat of the day began to ease, and I did not look at her right away, because not every moment needs eye contact to be understood, and after a few seconds, she spoke again, her voice lower than before, not sharp, not commanding, just present. "I did not know," she said, and those words carried something different, not quite an apology, not quite a defense, just an admission that the version of the situation she had created did not match reality anymore, and I lifted the container out of the truck slowly, feeling its weight settle into my grip, and I let a small breath out before answering. "That was the problem," I said evenly, and I walked past her toward the garage, not brushing against her, not forcing space, just moving forward the way I had intended to from the beginning, and she turned slightly as I passed, like she wanted to say something else, but was not sure what would still hold meaning now, and I set the container down inside, adjusting it carefully beside the others, the repetition of the motion grounding, familiar, a reminder that not everything needs to be complicated, and when I stepped back out again, she had shifted closer to the edge of the driveway, no longer planted in the center of it like before, and that alone said more than anything she could have explained, and I leaned briefly against the side of the truck, arms relaxed, taking in the street as it returned to its usual rhythm. A car passing in the distance, a door closing somewhere down the block, the quiet details that had been drowned out earlier now coming back into focus, and she spoke again, more hesitant this time. "I thought you were someone else," and I nodded slightly, not because it justified anything, but because it was true in its own way. She had built an entire story around who she thought I was without ever asking, without ever checking, and I pushed off the truck, standing upright again, looking at her directly now, and I said calmly, "You did not think I was someone else." I paused just long enough for the distinction to settle. "You decided I was." And that difference mattered, because thinking leaves room for correction, but deciding closes it off, and I could see that land in the way her expression shifted, not defensive this time, but reflective, like she was replaying the last few minutes in her head and hearing her own words differently now. And the space between us felt quieter, not tense, just clear, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, and I reached into the truck again, pulling out the final box, the cardboard slightly worn at the corners, and I held it there for a second, feeling the weight, the balance, the simplicity of it, and then I turned toward the garage once more, stepping forward without hesitation, because this was always how it was supposed to go. Just a man unloading his truck in his own driveway. Nothing more, nothing less. And behind me, I heard her shift again. But this time she did not call out. She did not try to stop anything. She just stood there. And that silence, finally, was not resistance. It was understanding, or at least the beginning of it. And as I set the last box down, inside, I realized that the most important part of this was not what had been said, not even what had been revealed, but what had changed without needing to be forced. And when I turned back toward the driveway, the space felt exactly like it should have from the start. Open, ordinary, and entirely mine. The garage felt quieter now, not because the street had gone silent, but because everything inside me had settled into a rhythm again, the kind that does not get shaken easily. And I stood there for a moment looking at the stacked boxes, each one placed exactly where it needed to be, the lines straight, the edges aligned, small details that most people would not notice, but that always mattered to me, because order is not about control. It is about clarity, and clarity has a way of revealing what chaos tries to hide. And I turned back toward the open garage, the late sun casting long shadows across the floor, stretching past the threshold and into the driveway. And she was still there, but not where she had been before, not in the center, not blocking anything, just off to the side now, like she was unsure where she was supposed to stand in a space that no longer revolved around her. And for a second, neither of us moved. The air between us calm, no longer charged, just present. And I stepped forward slowly, crossing that line from inside to outside again, not to confront, not to reclaim anything, because there was nothing left to take back, but simply to finish what I had started. And I walked past her without hesitation, heading toward the front of the truck, checking the tailgate, running my hand along the edge where dust had settled during the drive, and I could feel her watching, not with the same intensity as before, but with something quieter, something closer to awareness. And after a few seconds, she spoke again, her voice softer than it had been at any point since this began. "I should not have called them," she said, and there it was, not loud, not dramatic, but real, the first thing she had said that did not try to shift blame or reshape the moment into something else. And I paused, not turning immediately, letting that sentence exist on its own for a second, because some words need space to mean what they are supposed to mean. And then I looked back at her, steady, not cold, not warm, just clear, and I nodded once, acknowledging it without expanding it, because apologies do not need to be stretched to be understood. And I closed the tailgate with a firm but controlled motion, the sound sharp but final, and I wiped my hands together lightly, dust falling away in small, quiet particles. And the street around us continued its slow return to normal, a car passing by at a distance, a breeze moving through the trees, the kind of details that remind you that life does not pause for moments like this. It just absorbs them and moves forward. And she shifted her weight again, looking down briefly before meeting my eyes. "I just thought I was doing the right thing," she added, and I considered that for a second, not dismissing it, because intention and action are not always the same thing, and I spoke evenly. "Doing the right thing starts with understanding what is actually happening." And I let that settle, not as a correction, but as a boundary, something simple and clear that did not need to be argued. And she nodded slightly, slower this time, like she was processing it instead of reacting to it. And the distance between us felt different now, not something to close or defend, just something that existed without tension. And I stepped back toward the garage, reaching for the remote, pressing the button as the door began to lower with that same steady hum, the shadow line moving down inch by inch, closing off the space in a way that felt natural, not forced. And as it descended, I glanced at her one last time, standing there at the edge of the driveway, no longer trying to direct anything, no longer raising her voice, just present in the aftermath of a moment that had unfolded very differently than she expected. And I gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, just a simple acknowledgement that this was where things stood now. And when the garage door reached the ground with a soft final click, the boundary was clear again, not just physical, but understood. And I turned toward the interior of the garage, the air cooler, quieter, everything in its place, and I took a slow breath, feeling the last of the tension leave with it, because in the end, nothing about this had required force, nothing had required escalation. It had only required time, patience, and the willingness to let the truth stand on its own until there was nothing left to argue against. And outside, the street continued as if nothing had happened, but inside, everything was exactly as it should be. The quiet inside the garage lingered even after the doors settled into place, that low mechanical hum fading into something softer, almost like the house itself exhaling after holding its breath too long. And I stood there for a second longer than necessary, listening to it, letting the stillness settle into my shoulders, into my hands, into the space where tension had been just minutes ago. And I reached for the light switch, the soft click bringing a steady glow across the stacked boxes, the clean lines, the order that had not changed even when everything outside had. And I walked further in, adjusting one of the containers slightly, turning it just a few inches so it lined up perfectly with the others, not because it needed to, but because small corrections matter. They always do. And as I straightened up, I caught my reflection faintly in the side window of the garage door, a blur of shape and movement more than detail, but enough to remind me how easily people build an entire story from what they think they see, and how rarely they pause long enough to check if it is real. And I stepped toward the door that led into the house, my hand resting briefly on the handle, cool metal under my palm. And I paused again, not because I was unsure, but because something outside had shifted, not loud, not urgent, just a change in the rhythm, like a presence that had not fully left. And I turned my head slightly, listening. And there it was, faint but clear, the soft sound of footsteps on concrete just beyond the closed garage, not approaching, not retreating, just there. And I could tell without seeing that she had not gone far, that whatever had settled between us had not fully finished its course yet. And I let my hand fall away from the door, turning back toward the garage opening even though it was closed now, because some conversations do not end when the words stop. They continue in the silence that follows. And I walked back toward the center of the space, stopping a few feet from the door, as if distance still mattered even with a wall between us. And I spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, just enough to carry through the thin layers separating inside from outside. There is nothing else to resolve. And the words felt steady as they left, not defensive, not final in a harsh way, just clear. And for a moment there was no response, just that same quiet presence on the other side. And then her voice came through, softer than it had been at any point, almost uncertain. "I know," she said. And that was different, not an argument, not a correction, just acknowledgement. And I stood there, listening to the way that sounded, the way it settled into the space without resistance. And I took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, because that was what this had been building toward the entire time. Not a confrontation, not a victory, just an understanding that did not need to be forced into place. And I stepped closer to the door, not opening it, not needing to, just closing the distance enough to speak without raising my voice. "Then let it be done," I said. And there was a pause again, longer this time, like she was deciding whether to hold on to anything else or finally let it go. And when she spoke again, it was quieter still, almost carried by the air itself. "It is." And I nodded even though she could not see it. Because some responses are not meant to be seen, only understood. And I turned away from the door, walking back toward the boxes, toward the space that had remained unchanged through all of this, and I rested my hand on the top of the nearest container, feeling the solid surface under my fingers, something real, something simple, and I realized then that the most important part of this moment was not what had been said outside, not even what had been revealed, but what had not needed to happen. There had been no escalation, no force, no attempt to overpower, just patience, just clarity, and the willingness to let someone else see what they had missed on their own. And that kind of resolution does not echo. It settles, it stays quiet. It becomes part of the space without disturbing it. And as I reached up to turn off the light, the garage dimming back into shadow, I felt that same steadiness return fully, the kind that does not depend on anyone else's understanding to remain intact. And when I finally stepped through the door into the house, closing it softly behind me, the world outside stayed exactly where it belonged, separate, quiet, and no longer reaching in. The house was quiet in a way that felt complete, not empty, just settled, like everything had returned to its proper place without needing to be forced there. And I moved through the living room slowly, the faint scent of dust and wood lingering in the air from being closed up too long, sunlight slipping in through the blinds in thin lines across the floor, and I set my keys down on the counter with a soft, controlled motion, the small sound grounding. Familiar, a reminder that this space belonged to me long before any voice outside tried to question it. And I stood there for a moment, listening, not for anything specific, just letting the silence confirm what I already knew, that nothing from outside had followed me in, that whatever had happened in that driveway had ended exactly where it needed to, and I walked toward the window that faced the street, not out of concern, not out of curiosity, just habit, the kind that comes from years of being aware of your surroundings, without letting them control you. And I adjusted the blind slightly, just enough to see through without being seen. And there she was, still near the edge of the driveway, but not the same as before, not standing with that rigid certainty, not holding her phone like a tool of authority, just standing there, arms relaxed now, shoulders lower, like the weight of what had happened had finally settled into something she could not ignore. And for a second, she looked toward my house, not directly at the window, but close enough, like she was aware of it in a different way now, not as something to monitor or control, but as something to respect. And then she turned slightly, looking down the street, the same street that had been so quick to watch, to record, to assume, and I could see how empty it was now, doors closed, windows quiet, the attention gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only the reality behind. And I let the blind fall back into place, not hiding, just closing the view, because there was nothing left out there that needed my attention, and I walked back toward the center of the room, my footsteps steady against the floor, each one measured, each one mine, and I leaned lightly against the counter, folding my arms loosely, not defensive, not guarded, just at ease. And I let the events replay once, not in detail, not picking them apart, just observing the shape of it, the way it started, the way it escalated, the way it resolved without ever needing to break into something louder or harsher. And that was the part that stayed with me. Not the call, not the confrontation, but the restraint, the space given for the truth to stand on its own until there was no room left for anything else. And I pushed off the counter, walking toward the hallway, the light shifting slightly as I moved, the house responding in small, quiet ways that reminded me why I had chosen this place in the first place. Not for control, not for status, but for the simplicity of it, the clarity. And as I reached the end of the hallway, I paused again, just for a second, listening one last time, not for footsteps, not for voices, just for that same steady silence. And it was there, unchanged, consistent, and I nodded slightly to myself, not out of satisfaction, not out of victory, but out of recognition, because moments like that do not need to be won. They just need to be understood. And I continued forward, the space around me calm, grounded, exactly as it should be, while outside, whatever had shifted would settle in its own time, without me needing to guide it, correct it, or return to it, because some lessons do not require repetition. They only require one clear moment where everything that was assumed is replaced by what is real, and once that happens, nothing needs to be said again.